It should be clear to all Americans that we have a very serious left-wing terror threat in our country. Radicals associated with the domestic terror group Antifa that you've heard a lot about lately, and I've heard a lot about them for 10 years.
Ugh, even his voice gives me shingles. Hi, welcome back to Radical Leftist Scum. I'm your host, Valdez Salimai. Today we're diving into one of the most misunderstood, most politically weaponized words in America right now, Antifa. And I want to be very clear about something from the jump today. We're going to deal with facts, not feelings. So we'll separate what's real from political theater. We're going to connect it to something that happened literally last week that every American, regardless of where you stand politically, should be paying close attention. Because what's happening right now has implications that go far beyond any one group, any one ideology, or any one protest. We're talking about the First Amendment. We're talking about the power of the government to label its critics as terrorists. And we're talking about where that road leads if we don't ask hard questions. So let's get into it. So let's just start at the beginning. What even is Antifa? Well, the word itself is borrowed from a German word, which literally just means anti-fascist. So that's it. At its core, Antifa is an ideology. It's a belief that fascism is a real and active threat to democratic society and that needs to be confronted directly, and sometimes through street-level action. And we'll explore that more in this episode. But I want you to listen to this clip from the Huffington Post. I want us to learn more from Daryl Lamont Jenkins, who is an activist and executive director at One People's Project. And I want you to listen to his interview and just hear how he talks about what Antifa is. Here you go.
Antifa.
What is Antifa?
Whenever you see fascism, whenever you see people fighting against fascism or Nazism or any form of racism, you are looking at anti-fascism. You are looking at Antifa. Antifa is just simply an ideology. Antifa is simply just a way of thinking. Anti-fascists fight those who want to impose their will on everyone else and marginalize certain segments of society. We are fighting racism, bigotry, homophobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, misogyny.
I've seen them punch far-righters and fight with Nazis and all that. But I think thinking of them that way mischaracterizes them. In one town, the local anti-fascists might be working against ICE immigration proposals. It might be local anti-fascists fighting Nazis who have taken over the town. It might be protesters against cops. They might be working online to unmask violent white supremacist extremists in military and police units.
It's important to be out there to help folks find housing, find food. We're trying to raise money for food banks. In the case of my group, we have this open door policy. We're helping neo-Nazis who want to get out, come on out. We don't always have to be in the streets.
Does Antifa throw a brick or two through a window? Sure. Do they declare that they're willing to use violence if it means thwarting a white supremacist threat? Absolutely. Have we seen instances or a coordinated effort to harm other Americans? Absolutely not. There's just no evidence.
People were flying that particular symbol as their banner against Mussolini, against all those forces during World War II.
In 1919, Benito Mussolini established the Fascist Party in Italy. The dictator terrorized and intimidated his opponents, enforcing brutal policing tactics that helped him obtain power in the early 1920s. Anti-fascism was born in response to the violence. Where fascism went, anti-fascism followed, like Nazi Germany and Spain during its civil war. Now, the right-wing ideologies of fascism have re-emerged in the United States.
The conservatives in this country, the right wing in this country, are in a kind of survival mode. Now, the people that they have spent the past 400 years of all stripes keeping down are now coming up. The demographics are shifting. We are getting placed in positions of power. We're able to take down monuments that we never co-signed, ever, and never would have. We have a say.
In 2017, neo-Nazis and white supremacists boldly step out into the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, to protest the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee. They carried torches and held up their hands in Nazi salutes as they marched, chanting racist catchphrases. Even when a white supremacist killed a counter-protester, President Donald Trump claimed,
You had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Donald Trump has so demonized Antifa that he has declared them a terrorist organization. Antifa is not a terrorist organization. Trump's own national security agencies haven't found any evidence that Antifa is equal to or more than a threat than far-right extremist groups.
Okay, so here's what makes all of this complicated from a legal and a political standpoint. As we learned, Antifa is a decentralized political movement with no central leadership. There's no official headquarters. There's no membership structure. There is no Antifa president. There is no headquarters you can call or you can raid. There's no Antifa bank accounts. There's no money flowing anywhere. When the FBI's own director, Christopher Wray, was asked about it, he argued that Antifa is more of an ideology than an organization. And like we heard in the video, Antifa's core philosophy is anti-oppression. Antifa stands against fascism, racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism. Members, quote-unquote members, are generally left-leaning, with some adhering to maybe some more far-left ideologies like anarchy or anti-capitalism, but they don't typically align with Democratic Party, and that's, I think, where the confusion also is too. Tactics within the Antifa movement also vary widely. Some members engage in more peaceful counter-protests, hanging posters, giving speeches, marching even. Others have engaged in property destruction and physical confrontations with far-right groups. The movement does not have a unified code of conduct. Every local group or individual makes their own choices. Here's something worth sitting with. The anti-fascists of the 1930s are now regarded as heroes in mainstream history. The French Resistance, the partisans of Italy, the people who said no to Hitler before the rest of the world woke up. The modern Antifa movement draws ideological inspiration from those very people. European activist groups that originally organized to oppose World War II era fascist dictatorships reemerged in the 1970s and the 1980s to oppose white supremacy, to oppose skinheads, and eventually spread to the United States. Modern Antifa politics can be traced to opposition to the infiltration of Britain's punk scene by white power skinheads. In America, left-wing punk fans formed a group known as Anti-Racist Action in the 1980s, and some historians argue this inspired the modern Antifa movement in the US. So ARA groups traveled with punk bands to protect musicians and fans from harassment by neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups. Founded in 2007, Rose City Antifa in Portland, Oregon is the oldest U.S. group to use Antifa in its name. And we actually have to talk about that because if you all remember, there was in the news, at some point, Kristi Noem said that she had arrested the girlfriend of the leader of Antifa. But as you're hearing and as you're learning, as a lot of us already know, there is no leader. What actually happened was I looked into this and it's very interesting. There was in that group in Portland, the Rose City Antifa in Portland, was founded by a man named I'm going to make sure I get his name right, Johann Victorin and his girlfriend, they started that chapter, that area there. But those two, Victorin and his girlfriend, they have dual citizenship. They're Swedish and American. And so they fled to Sweden where they stayed. That is who Kristi Noem arrested as the girlfriend of the Victorins. So they both just share the last name. So I don't know if they were married. There's not a whole lot of information I can find on them. But I can tell you, Johann Victorin and Carolyn Victorin, Swedish-American, founded the Portland Rose Antifa group in 2007, but they've been hiding in Sweden since 2021. That is who Kristi Noem said that, and this is why, we'll talk about it today. They've labeled Antifa a domestic terrorist group. Donald Trump has labeled them a domestic terrorist group, but they can't be labeled that because they're not, because they don't actually have a structure. I believe this is their way of trying to say this is the structure. It's not. But I just want to share that. Now, let's talk about how it all evolved, because I think it's really important to also get into, because we know how it started, now how to get to where it is now. For most of its American history, Antifa operated in relative obscurity, showing up at neo-Nazi rallies, counter-protesting white nationalist events, largely flying under the radar, under the mainstream radar. That changed in 2017. Antifa groups in the United States gained prominent attention following the violent clashes between the white supremacists and their opponents in Charlottesville, Virginia on August 12, 2017. A woman named Heather Heyer was killed when a white nationalist drove a car into a crowd of counter-protesters. Suddenly, the question of whether it was acceptable to physically confront white supremacists was on front-page news. Then came 2020. George Floyd's murder, nationwide protests, and as protests raged in over 140 cities, President Trump raised the prospect of labeling Antifa as a terrorist group. He tweeted it, and Attorney General Barr talked about it. But nothing legally followed because, as we'll get to, there is no legal mechanism to make that happen. Now let's fast forward to September 2025. Following the murder of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, President Trump signed an executive order labeling Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. And then, on July 4th, 2025, a group of protesters showed up at an ICE detention facility in Alvarado, Texas, and things turned violent. And one man shot a police officer. And now, in March 2026, we have convictions on that. And we're going to talk a lot about that in detail in just a few moments. But first, I want to talk about what Antifa is not. We have to be precise about what it's not, because the term has been stretched far beyond its meaning. Antifa is not a formal organization. Antifa has no central command, no definitive texts, and no clear command and control organizational structure. You cannot, quote unquote, join Antifa the way you would join the Proud Boys, the KKK, or even the Democratic Party. There are no dues, no membership cards, no chain of command. Antifa is not the Democratic Party. Antifa members are generally left-leaning, but they do not typically align with the Democratic Party. And in fact, many Antifa people who adhere to Antifa consider mainstream liberal politics to be too timid and too tied to the system that they're opposing. And Antifa is not every left-wing protester. According to the Anti-Defamation League, the term Antifa is, in their words, is often misapplied to include all counter-protesters. Calling every progressive activist an Antifa member is like calling every person who waves the American flag a member of the Proud Boys. Antifa is not a legally designated terrorist organization under U.S. law. And we're going to get into that now. Because this is where things get constitutionally important. On September 22nd, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order declaring Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. The White House called it a, quote, a militarist anarchist enterprise that explicitly calls for the overthrow of the United States government. Those are some strong words. But here's what legal experts from across the political spectrum, including the Brennan Center for Justice, the ACLU, and the Congressional Research Service, all said in response. The president does not have the legal authority to do this. The administration has no authority to designate groups as domestic terrorist organizations, as is obvious from the failure to cite any statute or any constitutional provision in support of the president's action. There is none, and the purported designation has no legal effect. Why doesn't this legal mechanism exist? Because of the First Amendment. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security don't officially designate U.S. extremist groups as domestic terrorist organizations, in part because of First Amendment concerns. The government can designate foreign terrorist organizations like Hamas, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, but domestic groups operating inside the United States are protected by constitutional rights to free speech, free association, and free assembly. So this order sets a precedent. The U.S. has never designated a domestic terrorist group organization before. And the reason that precedent never existed is because doing so collides directly with the Bill of Rights. The Supreme Court has long protected the freedom to associate for the advancement of beliefs and ideas, and the First Amendment imposes strict constraints upon the government's ability to punish even speech advocating illegal conduct. So to learn more, I want you to take a listen to this clip from CBS News with host Elizabeth Cook and Daniel Byman, the director of the Warfare, Irregular Threats, and Terrorism program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS. Take a listen to learn more.
President Donald Trump hosted a roundtable event today with conservative influencers about Antifa. Participants included members of the president's cabinet, along with several journalists who say they have had experiences with Antifa members. Let's bring in Daniel Byman, the director of the CSIS Warfare, Irregular Threats, and Terrorism program, and he joins us live from Hanover, New Hampshire. Dan, thanks so much for being with us. President Trump wants Antifa classified as a domestic terrorist group. It's important to note there's no official leader of this group, and it's more of kind of an ideology. Does it fit the profile, do you think, of a terrorist organization? What makes it different than, say, an Al-Qaeda or Hamas?
So there are some big differences. First of all, the designation process for the United States is focused on foreign groups, not domestic groups. So we've had a range, of course, of very violent groups in the United States, but the terrorism label might be used rhetorically, but they're not designated the way an Al-Qaeda or Hamas might be. But the biggest difference is almost conceptual. Al-Qaeda and Hamas are actual groups. They have membership roles. They have clear leaders. They're organized. Antifa is really an ideology, and anyone can claim to adhere to it. And as a result, it doesn't have much form. It's just a set of ideas.
So what's the ultimate goal of a group or an ideology like Antifa then? Is there an ultimate goal?
So it's going to vary by individual who embraces it. And the name simply signifies anti-fascist. And some see themselves as defenders of people who are marching in support of Black or gay rights. Others see themselves as going after the far right and people who are using violence in the past, groups like the Proud Boys or Oath Keepers. But there's a wide variety of motivations, but in general, it's on the far left of the American political spectrum.
Where are we seeing the most action from Antifa followers? I mean, covering maybe protests over the years, we've seen them show up in different cities, protesting different political statements, and many of them cause trouble during the protests. Is that what you're seeing mostly from Antifa? Is that kind of their mission?
That's been their focus. But there's also an Antifa that is online and emphasizes doxing or revealing public information. about far-right members who might be behind hoods. So there's a street presence, there's an online presence, and then there are simply individuals who adhere to the ideology who don't actually end up doing much.
You know, we have seen, though, a rise in political violence by individuals on both sides of the political spectrum. Do you attribute that to groups like Antifa and others on the far right?
No. So in both the far right and the far left, there are individuals acting, but they're not people who are tied to particular groups. So if you look at the man who was accused of killing Charlie Kirk, just to take a very recent example, no one is saying that he was part of an organized group. The man who killed Minnesota legislator Melissa Hortman earlier this year, on the far right, he was not a member of the group. So we're seeing individuals act, but these are not organized groups that are well established in the United States.
You wrote a book called Spreading Hate, The Global Rise of White Supremacist Terrorism. How big of a threat are these far right and far left groups nationwide and throughout the world?
So a lot's going to vary by particular period, but they have killed a lot of people. And some of the bloodiest attacks in the last 10 years in the United States have been by a white supremacists. But we're seeing this as a much more global ideology, where individuals and groups in New Zealand and Europe and the United States are talking to each other, sharing ideas, and really coming together as part of a broader cause, but they're not coordinating operations, thankfully.
Daniel Byman, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You know, Byman touched on something I covered in one of my more recent episodes about how MAGA and the right wing allowed authoritarianism to creep into our country by their cult-like commitment and their obedience to Donald Trump. And as in any authoritarian regime, there has to be an enemy, or like an enemy from within, as Donald Trump put it. MAGA thinks they are fighting for our country as patriots, but they actually handed the country over to Donald Trump, who is destroying it while fighting those who are trying to save it. So we have just stepped even further into fascism and authoritarianism. But I also want you to get an idea of how radical the right is and the danger they pose to everyone. So I have a clip here that I want you from MSNBC. And here we have Mark Bray, who's a history professor from Rutgers University, who had to flee the United States because he was receiving death threats from the right about a book that he wrote about authoritarianism several years ago and some research that he's done on it. Take a listen.
That a university professor and his family have had to flee the country. This week, Rutgers University historian Mark Bray fled to Spain after he says his family received a torrent of death threats after President Trump characterized the left-wing anti-fascist movement as a domestic terrorist organization. And the Rutgers chapter of right-wing student organization Turning Point USA launched a petition for his removal. Now, to be clear, Bray says he is not a part of Antifa and that his association is solely as an academic who's studied it. And Antifa is not, by the way, an actual organization with founders or leadership. It's a loose, decentralized term for a movement, but it's increasingly being used by the right as a label for a wide range of left-leaning causes, nonprofits, and protesters. Joining us now is Rutgers history professor Mark Bray. He's also the author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. Professor Bray, thank you for making time for us. First, how are you and your family? You just moved to Spain. Walk us through what led you to move and to get to this point.
Right. Well, as you said, following Trump's executive order declaring Antifa a terrorist organization, which you gave me a great lead up in terms of how that is completely ridiculous, I received a wave of death threats. Pushed on by a number of right-wing provocateurs online, pushed on by Turning Point USA at my campus, pushed on by Fox News. It led to the point where my address was posted on X, and I felt unsafe in my home and increasingly unsafe in the country. When I tried to leave the country on Wednesday, my reservation was mysteriously canceled at the last second. I don't know exactly what happened with that, but it was awfully fishy. And then I was stopped searched and interrogated by federal agents as I made my way out of the country on Thursday, despite facing no charges for any crimes whatsoever. As you said, I'm an investigator. I'm a dad. I'm just trying to live my life. I'm not even writing about anti-fascism anymore. This is about a book I wrote 8 years ago. So it really shows, I think, the kind of authoritarian creep going on with the Trump administration.
Given your expertise, Professor, can you tell us what Antifa is, what it's not? I mean, where did it originate from? Why has this become the obsession of the right? And honestly, in a very kind of simple way, why is it bad to be anti-fascist? Why is that now being used as a label? In some ways, don't we all want to be opposed to fascism?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Fascism is bad. Being anti-fascist is good. As far as your specific question, Antifa is originally an abbreviation from Germany that goes back to the early 20th century opposition to Hitler. Antifa is a loose term for anti-fascist groups that bring together different kinds of leftists and radicals and anti-fascists in coalition to oppose the far right through a variety of different tactics. We saw it, of course, in the U.S. most famously with Charlottesville. But in a sense, as you point out, this really has nothing to do with Antifa. They haven't been in the news for 5 years since, of course, Trump tried to blame the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 and all of the kind of social upheaval we saw then on Antifa. It's about creating a boogeyman term to demonize not only self-described leftists, but liberals, protesters, anyone who the Trump administration deems as an enemy. The authoritarian fascist playbook in history is pretty clear that you can't simply demonize people without creating this loose framework for incriminating anyone that you want to. And that's why, you know, it's no surprise that we've seen Republican politicians calling the upcoming No King's Day protest a kind of gathering of what they refer to as the pro-Hamas crowd in an effort to demonize Palestine solidarity protesters, Antifa, Marxists. It's a catch-all and really has nothing to do with anti-fascism so much as demonizing protests and equating with terrorism.
So, Professor, one of the phrases that the far-right activists who have really honed in on you, it's in the introduction to your book, and you say a call to arms, and they use that as saying, like, oh, this is rhetoric that is inciting violence. Now, frankly, it's a figure of speech. I think that we've gotten way snowflakey in policing what, you know, phrases that are commonly used and manipulating it for our own partisan political purposes. But if you went back and rewrote your introduction, would you still use that phrase?
Yeah, it means that we need to organize against fascism. Right. And so my book is a history book. I come at it as a scholar. I interviewed more than 60 anti-fascists from 17 different countries. I have a PhD. I've been working on the history of the left for a long time. But I also really don't like fascism. And I would really like people to organize against fascism. So, you know, that criticism just sounds like people that haven't read a lot of literature, to be honest. If it wasn't that, they would have honed in on something else. This is not a good faith engagement. This is an effort to take words, take ideas, twist them entirely out of context. I mean, they've compared Antifa to ISIS, for crying out loud. You know, this is not a fair conversation. We need to recognize the rhetorical games being played here and the end purpose of really making protests seem like terrorism, which is, of course, ridiculous. Our country is a history rich with protests of all sorts, and that's what we should be celebrating, not demonizing.
Now, of course, that's not a surprise. Like, and it's scary to hear that, but also not surprising because we know how MAGA and the right feel about things like education. And of course, I cringe when I hear Turning Point USA because Turning Point is a large contributor to the anti-intellectual movement in this country. And Charlie Kirk was definitely the leader of anti-intellectualism. And I hold him responsible for why so many uneducated people feel so brazen by their ignorance. You know, all these people call higher education woke and liberal propaganda because they themselves are pretty uneducated. And that's the way they want to stay. And they've been empowered to believe that that's actually okay. They are contributing to this nightmare. And the reality is the right is way more dangerous to this country than anyone else. And actually, I want us to get even more into that as well. I have another clip here that I want to show you from PBS where there's a really great breakdown about what's going on when it comes to the left and the right. So take a listen to this.
President Trump is targeting the left-wing Antifa movement, labeling it a domestic terrorist organization, even though no such designation exists under U.S. law. The move follows a weekend memorial for conservative activist Charlie Kirk, who was shot and killed at a college campus event less than 2 weeks ago. Top Republicans have been calling for increased scrutiny of Antifa since Kirk's assassination, even though so far the man accused of shooting Kirk has no publicly known link to the movement. We're joined now by Luke Baumgartner, a research fellow with George Washington University's program on extremism. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So what exactly is Antifa? How do you describe its core beliefs and tactics?
So simply put, Antifa is just short for anti-fascist. If you want to get more simple than that, it just means the opposition to fascism. Now, their belief system has a fairly wide range of encompassing ideologies, mostly on the political left, and they encompass anarchists, socialists, communists, and a lot of people in between there.
So how is it organized, if at all? Are there actual leaders or networks for the administration to target, or is that just a misconception?
No, it's a widely held misconception, especially those who are looking to try and target this idea of Antifa. There is no hierarchical organizational structure. It is primarily a movement and an ideology. And there are no leaders, there are no assets, there are no bank accounts or revenue streams to go after it either.
Given all of that, is it a genuine security threat? Is it a political scapegoat or something in between?
I would classify it more as a political scapegoat, honestly. There have been incidents of political violence linked to far-left extremists in the U.S. in recent years, but the overwhelming majority of the data points towards far-right extremism being a much more serious threat to national security.
Tell me more about that.
In the last 5, 6, 7 years, or the last 10 years more broadly, we have seen a rise in left-wing or left-aligned political violence. You can look at the shooting at the congressional baseball game as one, or the recent attacks on a ICE facility or the CBP station down in Texas. But data bears out time and time again from the University of Maryland, from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as my own work at the Program on Extremism, that political violence in the U.S. has overwhelmingly been attributed to those on the far right end of the political spectrum.
President Trump signing an executive order designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, a label that doesn't exist in U.S. law. What legal weight, if any, does that carry?
Not much, to be honest. Like you said, there is no codified prohibition for domestic terrorist groups in the U.S. that does not exist in U.S. penal code the way it would for foreign terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. So the full brunt and the full weight of the U.S. government and law enforcement agencies can't exactly come down on it like they would for others. And as I mentioned before, there's no bank accounts, there's no revenue streams, and there's no well-known or at least well-documented proof of funding.
So does this move then give the administration cover to brand and prosecute virtually anyone it opposes as Antifa?
I would say so, and that label's been used in the past. Anytime there's been any sort of resistance to far-right extremism or any of the administration's policies, you know, the 5150 protests, the No Kings protests, the Black Lives Matters protests, that was always labeled as Antifa. And it's this nebulous concept that's been, put into the minds of the administration that these are the enemies.
Okay, so now let's pull it into current events, because now we have to talk about what happened in Texas, because this is the most important and the most nuanced part of this entire conversation. Last week, on March 13, 2026, a federal jury in Fort Worth delivered verdicts in what has been called the first ever federal trial involving Antifa-related domestic terrorist charges. The jury convicted most of the 9 members of an alleged quote-unquote Antifa cell for supporting terrorists, and 1 member for attempted murder. Let's listen to this clip from the 5-minute news to learn more.
The unjust conviction of 9 protesters in Texas today has been portrayed as a victory against Antifa terrorism. Prosecutors claimed the demonstrators were part of an Antifa cell and argued their actions during a protest outside an immigration detention center amounted to supporting terrorism. But the case reveals something far more troubling than a supposed militant network. It highlights how the concept of Antifa has been distorted into a political weapon, one used to criminalize dissent and manufacture a domestic enemy. The central problem with the narrative is simple. Antifa is not an organization. It is not a secret network, a clandestine movement, or an underground militant group. The term simply means anti-fascist. People who describe themselves as Antifa are expressing opposition to fascism, authoritarian politics built on nationalism, repression, and the suppression of democratic opposition. That position is hardly radical. In fact, opposing fascism is one of the most widely shared values in modern democratic societies. After the Second World War, it became a foundational principle of the political order in the United States and much of the world. Most Americans, regardless of political affiliation, would say they oppose fascism. In that sense, Antifa is not a fringe movement operating in the shadows. It's simply the collective label for people who reject fascist politics. The reason Antifa has no centralized leadership, membership lists, or formal structure is precisely because it represents such a broad segment of society. There is no headquarters for people who oppose fascism. There is no chain of command for ordinary citizens who object to authoritarian rule. The absence of organization is not the evidence of secrecy. It is evidence that the term describes a shared belief rather than a coordinated movement. Yet in recent years, Donald Trump and his political allies have deliberately recast Antifa as something sinister. Trump repeatedly described it as a terrorist organization and attempted to designate it as one, despite having no legal authority to do so. The effort was never about legal accuracy, it was about political storytelling. By portraying Antifa as a shadowy extremist network, Trump created a convenient domestic enemy. The name itself helps the illusion. Antifa sounds foreign, vaguely militant, and ominously similar to the names of terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda. That resemblance is politically useful. It encourages supporters to imagine that political opposition is not coming from ordinary Americans, but from a dangerous internal conspiracy. Now, this narrative serves an obvious purpose. If critics of government policy can be labeled terrorists, their arguments no longer need to be addressed. They can simply be dismissed as enemies of the state. The Texas case shows how this rhetoric is beginning to move from political theater into the justice system. The charges stem from a 4th of July protest at the Prairieland Immigration Detention Center outside Fort Worth. Demonstrators gathered for what is known as a noise protest, a common tactic used to show solidarity with people being held inside detention facilities. The idea was simple. By setting off fireworks and making noise outside the facility, detainees would know that people outside were aware of their situation and supporting them. Things went wrong quickly. A small number of protesters vandalized property in the parking lot, spray painting surfaces, slashing the tires of a government vehicle, and damaging a security camera. When guards confronted them and police arrived, the situation escalated. One protester, Benjamin Song, fired a rifle and struck a police officer in the shoulder, though the officer survived. There is no dispute that the shooting was serious and criminal, but the prosecution went far beyond the actions of a single individual. Instead, it argued that the entire group was part of a coordinated terrorist conspiracy tied to Antifa. 9 defendants were tried together on charges including rioting, weapons offences, attempted murder, and providing material support for terrorism. Yet even within the trial, the idea that the group constituted an organized Antifa cell proved difficult to support. Some of the defendants had never met before the protest. Others knew each other only through unrelated social circles such as book clubs, political discussions, or firearms training groups. The prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence meant to suggest ideological extremism. Investigators presented anti-Trump stickers, left-wing reading materials, and small independent publications known as zines. One pamphlet displayed to the jury included an image of a swastika being thrown into a trash can, a fairly straightforward symbol of anti-fascism. Encrypted messaging apps were also cited as evidence of conspiracy. The protesters used Signal, an app that allows messages to disappear automatically. But this practice is common among journalists, activists, ordinary citizens, and even the US government. Likewise, the prosecution pointed to the defendants' dark clothing, describing it as tactical gear, even though many of the items could be purchased at everyday retail stores. Even more striking is that the terrorism statute used in the case does not require any connection to a terrorist organization. Legally speaking, prosecutors did not need to prove that Antifa existed as a group at all. The charge simply requires showing that someone assisted another person in committing certain serious crimes. Now, this contradiction became clear during the final moments of the trial. The presiding judge questioned why the term Antifa should even be mentioned in the jury instructions. His comment exposed the gap between the political narrative surrounding the case and the actual legal framework being used. In other words, Antifa dominated the rhetoric of the trial, even though it was essentially irrelevant to the law. The fact reveals the deeper significance of the case. The label was not used because it clarified the charges. It was used because it carries political power. The United States has reached a moment where political leaders increasingly treat dissent itself as a threat. Protesters opposing government policies, whether immigration enforcement, policing, or authoritarian rhetoric, are being reframed as extremists. By invoking Antifa, the government can blur the line between protest and terrorism. This represents a dangerous turning point. In democratic societies, protest is not only legal, but essential. It's one of the primary ways citizens express opposition to government actions. When dissent is recast as terrorism, that basic democratic principle begins to erode. Ironically, the real political extremism in contemporary American politics is not coming from loosely connected protesters opposing fascism. It's coming from movements openly questioning democratic norms, attacking the legitimacy of elections, and embracing authoritarian rhetoric. Labeling ordinary critics as terrorists allows those movements to deflect attention away from their own radicalism. That is why the myth of Antifa persists. It's not an underground army waiting to strike. It's simply the collection name for people who oppose fascism. Teachers, students, workers, journalists, and ordinary citizens who believe authoritarian politics should be resisted. And there are millions of them, because most Americans still believe that democracy is worth defending. Calling that belief terrorism does not reveal a hidden conspiracy. It reveals a political strategy. When leaders can no longer silence dissent through argument, they attempt to criminalize it instead.
Yeah, so this is wild. I mean, for them to include Antifa into this trial when it had nothing to do with it, and the fact that it was because of they were basically convicted of terrorism charges for wearing black clothing because they thought that that was an Antifa tactic that was assisted in the shooting. So what that means, if that any of us are out in the street and we happen to be wearing certain clothes, we could easily be called Antifa. That would be it. This is scary. The risk of abuse here is particularly acute because under the material support statute, any aid, even if not meant to support violence, is now enough to incur a hefty prison term. Buying a sandwich for an activist, allowing a protester to crash on your couch, or briefly lending a computer to print pamphlets critical of government policy could all be considered like potentially material support. This is going to have some very wide-reaching effects on protests. And one civil liberties attorney said that the case helps the government just see how far they can go in criminalizing constitutionally protected protests. This could increase fear, and it could cause folks in other cities to think twice about protesting. And that's exactly the point. This is all by design. Our authoritarian government and its red hat followers are intentionally doing this to deter people from uprising and revolting against them. Remember, this is like Nepal overthrew their own government. And They don't want us to do that. So Donald Trump is trying to create the situation where he can enact Insurrection Act of 1807 against, quote, domestic terrorists to give himself absolute power. And that is how he thinks he's going to take over the midterm elections and to prevent the Epstein files from coming out. And those Epstein files are going to fucking come out. So this is the issue at hand. They are purposely creating the environment to make us obedient so that we don't revolt and resist their authoritarianism. But here's the thing. The First Amendment is not a suggestion. It is the foundational promise of this republic. And right now, it is under pressure. The right to protest, even protest that makes people uncomfortable, even protest that is angry and loud and disruptive, is constitutionally protected. The Supreme Court has upheld this repeatedly, including for groups whose ideas most Americans find repugnant. The administration has supercharged the use of domestic terrorism investigations to scare Americans away from using their First Amendment rights to oppose its policies. These tactics risk criminalizing constitutionally protected activity, from joining a protest march to posting on social media, while inflicting draconian punishments for actions that are far removed from actual terrorism. And there's research on this too. Like research from the National Institute of Justice has found that militant, nationalistic, white supremacist, violent extremism has increased in the United States, and that far-right extremists have committed far more ideologically motivated homicides than far-left extremists. We heard that before, and I'm bringing it back here. Yet the power of quote-unquote domestic terrorist organization designation is being aimed exclusively at the left. When the government can label any movement it dislikes as terrorism without legal authority, without due process, without even a clear definition of membership, every American's rights are at risk. Not just left-wing Americans, all Americans. Once Antifa receives a formal designation, any naturalized citizen who attended a counter-protest, donated to a legal defense fund, or expressed support for anti-fascist principles could face citizenship revocation proceedings. Think about it. Attending a protest, donating to a legal fund, that's the America being built right now. So where does that leave us? What do we do with all this? First and foremost, you have to know your rights. The ACLU has a ton of free resources on your rights at protests, your rights if you're investigated, your rights, period. So that knowledge is power. It's important for you to educate yourself. You also need to demand precision in language. When politicians and media figures call every left-wing protester an Antifa terrorist, push back. Ask for evidence. Ask for specifics. Sloppy language is a tool of control. Hold violence accountable across the board. If someone shoots a police officer, that's serious and demands accountability. And if a white nationalist drives a car into a crowd, that's equally serious. We cannot apply terrorism charges selectively based on the ideology. The law must be applied equally, or it means nothing. Support civil liberties organizations like the ACLU, the Brennan Center for Justice, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. These organizations are fighting legal battles right now that will determine the boundaries of your rights for decades. Please stay engaged. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us citizens who are informed, who vote, who organize, who speak loudly and clearly, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. And I recently just posted this on my Instagram. Use your voice. The right is dominating the podcast space. They're dominating media. I mean, we know that right wing's owning like mainstream media, but even like podcasts. 40% of younger people get their information from podcasts, and podcasts tend to have more there's 6 out of 10 of the top podcasts on Spotify are all right wing. Create a podcast. Use your voice. We need to talk. We need to stay informed. We need to organize. This is how we break through this domestic terrorist thing of Antifa. The moment people stop protesting, not because they have no grievances, but because they're afraid of being called terrorists, is the moment that fear has done the government's work for it. And that's what they want. Here's the bottom line. Antifa is a century-old idea rooted in opposition to fascism. In America, it is a leaderless, decentralized movement, an ideology, not an organization. It has no legal structure to designate, there's no headquarters to raid, and there's no leadership to arrest. The government's attempt to designate it as a domestic terror group has no legal foundation and poses direct threats to the First Amendment rights of every single American. And that Texas case, while involving real violence that deserved accountability, is also being used as a test case just to see how far the government can go in criminalizing dissent. History has a consistent lesson. Governments that label their political opponents as terrorists without due process, without evidence, and without legal authority are governments moving in a very dangerous direction. You don't have to like Antifa. You don't have to agree with their tactics, but you do have to care about the Constitution, because the rights that they're eroding today are the rights you'll need tomorrow. Friend, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking the hard questions. This is Radical Leftist Scum Podcast. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.